Part 4, Drums. In this segment, we're going to touch on drums, both on the specifics of King of Thebes itself, and then again, some more general thoughts on the subject as always. So I'm going to give you a glimpse into my workflow to give you an idea of how someone could approach drums potentially. So this is just one possible way of many, many ways to do it. This is not supposed to be a how to do drums the right and only way type of tutorial. This is more of a suggestion, if anything, okay? So just observe and take whatever makes sense to you and leave the rest aside, because at the end of the day, your goal is to figure out a way that's going to be unique to you, right? Provided, of course, that your aim is to create a unique style for yourself, which is not something that everyone wants. Some people actually do not desire that. There are music producers who see themselves more as a service provider than an artist, which is totally fine, by the way. We need people like that as well. Not everyone can be and should be an artist. And if you want to make a living as a producer, a good way to start is actually to produce for clients, right? So ghost production might be a topic, or getting placements with your beats and stuff like that. So for them, it's more important to figure out the fastest way to get their tracks done or to get an idea across. So efficiency is a key factor. And also they're more interested in how to get a certain sound that's already popular so you can attract more clients and stay relevant that way. And my approach, on the other hand, leans more towards, I guess, the artistic side, with an emphasis on exploration, which is very different from the service provider standpoint, where it's all about getting to a specific destination. So I'm more about, how do I get lost deliberately, okay? So let me be clear, the way I work is not efficient. It's slow, it's convoluted. So if you're looking for efficiency, this series is probably not the right content for you to consume. However, if you're looking to give your work some personality, this approach might suit you well. And the reason I even mentioned this whole thing with different types of producers is because you need to be clear about your own goals as a producer. Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to sell beats? Do you want to be your own artist? Do you want to work with clients? What do you want to do? If you're not clear about that, then these types of videos and podcasts might actually be a major waste of your time. Like, if you're looking into selling beats, then listen to a guy who sold a bunch of beats. Don't listen to me, okay? If that makes sense. Anyway, consider yourself warned. Let's talk about drum samples. We already talked about the mindset behind sample choice in the second part of this series, so if you haven't watched it, please go ahead and do, because what I'm about to say will make a little more sense to you. So with King of Thebes specifically, I was going for a very clean, pointy, controlled, almost sterile type of sound for the drums, because I needed something that could stand out from the soft and wet synths and vocals that are present in the track. So this goes back to the whole issue of context and contrast that I was talking about 2 videos ago. And people sometimes ask me how I get my drums to be so snappy and pointy, and the answer is, to be honest, I do not much except picking snappy and pointy samples to begin with. So I can't really take that much credit for that. And then, of course, the follow-up question is, well, then where do I find samples like this? And, you know, it's a long process of collecting sample packs over the years and then only keeping the ones that you're excited about. So these samples aren't all from the same pack. There are from many different packs that I collected and sorted out. So for these types of drum sounds, there was a time around 2012, 2013, somewhere along those lines, where drum and bass, so the genre, was kind of going through a phase where everything was super minimal and dry. I don't know if you guys remember this, or any of you are into drum and bass, but this is, I think, where I got those samples from. So if you just keep collecting stuff for a longer period of time, chances are it might become super cool again in like 5 years from now, okay? Because music production, all it is all a recycling of shit that we already forgot about, okay? And if you have been in the game for, let's say, 10 or 20 years, I think you kind of begin to see the pattern. It's amazing to me that there's still a market for sample packs. Like if you're broke but you're serious about your library, you could just go online and visit old forums and shit like that, or go on Reddit and download all these free sample packs and make the most amazing library for yourself without even spending a single penny. Of course, it takes time, but if you're broke, you usually got time on your hands, so why not do it? By the way, you can download the drum samples from this track for free. Just use the link in the description. It's just a Dropbox link, so I'm not charging you anything, and it's not even tracking you, so no strings attached. And The King of Thebes drums are part of the Nuggets drum kit, so if you're interested, there it is. So again, it's 90% sample choice, but there's a couple of quick tips and tricks to make your drums extra pointy. Okay, so here's 4 little tricks to make your drums a little bit more pointy or snappy. So what we got here is a kick drum. Let me just make an exact copy of this kick, and then we're gonna process that one. So if we play them at the same time, as you can see, they're absolutely identical. All right, so trick number 1, which is really just a cheap trick, but sometimes, you know, it makes all the difference, and it is pitching up the sample. Okay, so select the second kick, and then make sure you are in resampling mode, because we want to affect the timing as well. So if you're going to put this on stretch, for example, which is a different mode, the timing will stay intact no matter which way you pitch it. So this is good if you want to change the pitch without affecting the tempo or anything else. This is good for vocals and stuff like that if you just want to change the key of a sample. But we're going to stay in resampling mode for now, which allows us to either stretch or contract the sample as we're changing the pitch. So let's pitch this kick up a couple of semitones. Let's say 3 or 4. Let's play it. Now, if you compare it to the first one, it's not that much of a difference, but you can already see by contracting the sample, it gets shorter. So it gets a little bit tighter and it dies off quicker. And this can sometimes be easier to mix because there's potentially less time for interference with other elements, at least in theory. I mean, it's only a couple of milliseconds, so it's not going to make the difference, but you know, small changes can actually make a huge difference at the end of the day. So now if we play them at the same time, you can see that the second kick, the orange one, shifted all of its frequency content towards the right, which means towards the top end. And the part that's responsible for the pointiness of a sample is its transient, which is the initial part of the sample. So basically we got the transient and we got the tail part of a sample. So pitching up a sample shortens the tail, but also accentuates the transient. Now, what makes a sample snappy isn't the bass, right? It's the higher frequencies. So the transient is made up by high frequency content. So the more top end you have, naturally, the harsher it becomes, the snappier, the pointier, the more precise, I guess you can call it, the sample becomes. Now I will play this and mess around with the pitch. As you can see, the more I pitch it up, the more the entire sample shifts towards the right, which again means more higher frequencies altogether. And if I pitch it down, however, look at the orange graph, it moves down the frequency spectrum. You can't hear anything now because I disabled the sound, because this would sound really annoying, but I hope it's clear without hearing it. Right, let's turn it up again. So once again, if you pitch it up, it's going to make it more pointy. If you want to make it softer, you can pitch it down. But be really careful with this because this doesn't work always, especially with pitching down. There's a limit on how much you can stretch a sample before it sounds like absolute garbage. So use your ears, please. 1 or 2 semitones usually work fine. Everything beyond that tends to be risky. Pitching things up is not as much of a problem than pitching things down. So like I said, it's just a cheap trick that doesn't work all the time. You're going to have to make a call on a case-by-case basis. So for example, if your sample is very tonal, make sure to pitch it according to the key of the track, or at least choose a pitch that doesn't sound off with the rest of the track. So it's going to be different for every sample, and sometimes you can really fuck around and it produces cool effects. But in practice, most of the time, it's usually not more than 1 to 3 semitones that work. So that would be trick number 1. Trick number 2 is the good old equalizer. Like I said before, the frequency that's responsible for snappiness is the top end. So if you slightly boost the higher frequencies, you can give your drums a little more presence. And again, this has to be done really carefully because the more you do this, if you overdo this, everything will sound harsh. Anyway, now look at the spectrum analyzer again. And as you can see it in comparison with the other kick, see how the top end is slightly boosted. And you can also attenuate some of the lower mids and bass to emphasize the transient. Okay, so this would be obvious trick number 2, use an EQ. Then trick number 3 is to use a compressor with a slow attack setting. Now what that means is, wait, where's my compressor? A compressor with a slow attack setting is going to kick in later. So whatever your settings are on the compressor, at what threshold it starts working, how much it decreases volume, and so on, will happen after the transient has already passed, right? So the transient stays intact, and then it's going to bring the volume of the tail down. So it's all about emphasizing the transient while minimizing the tail part of the sample. So in practice, it would sound something like this. So this would be without, and this is with. Of course, I got a little bit too much makeup gain. So with, without, with, and without. And if you're not a fan of compressors, you can actually just draw the volume envelope by hand. So the equivalent of this compressor setting would look something like this. Now the way to pull up a volume automation for a specific sample is by clicking on the top left corner of the clip, then go to automate and then select volume. So now you can draw a volume envelope for that specific sample before it gets into the mixer. Okay, so whatever you draw in here will then go into the mixer, and then this signal will get affected by your effects. So this is just one little side note on signal flow in FL Studio. Anyway, what I'm going to do is to leave the transient alone and then just lower the volume on the tail like that. So this is basically what the compressor does. Close enough. Just listen to this. So that would be the equivalent of that. And then trick number 4, which is kind of a fancy way of doing all of that, is to use a so-called transient shaper plugin. There's a lot of different ones on the market. I'm using the one by Native Instruments. So what it does is basically a combination of EQ and the compressor thing. A compressor with a slow attack that allows the transient to come through, plus some boost on the top end. Let's see how it looks in the spectrum analyzer. Now it's bypassed, so the two kicks are completely identical. Now I turn it on, and as you can see, the top end is slightly boosted. Some of the lower frequencies seem to be being cut, but this could be just the influence of the compressor. You can use a plugin like that if nothing else works. If you tried all the cheaper tricks and the transient shaper still sounds the best, then use that one. But be careful, it can be really heavy on the CPU if you put all sorts of dynamic processing plugins in your project. So if you're using a transient shaper like this and you like the sound, I would make sure to freeze the clip or to bounce the sample as audio and then re-import it into the project, because otherwise, if it's a kick or something, it needs to recalculate that transient every time it hits, which can be really heavy on your resources. Because, you know, dynamics processing plugins tend to act up and cause latency issues, so that's why I don't like to use too many of those when I'm creating. And most of the time, to be honest, I can't even tell a compressor from a simple volume envelope, so I'm sorry, I'm just using the volume envelope because I have the visual representation right away and don't need to fuck with numbers that much, but that's just a personal preference. Anyway, that would be my 4 tricks for more pointiness. All it is really at the end of the day is the right balance between the tail and the transient. Okay, so far so good. Let's move on to sidechaining. Alright, I don't want to spend too much time talking about sidechaining because either you're completely unfamiliar with the concept, which means you need to watch a lot of YouTube tutorials to even get a grasp on the whole thing, or you already know what it is and you have your technique down, right? So either way, I'm just going to show you my quick and lazy way to do sidechain compression without the compressor though. So the normal way to do it is, let's say I've got my sub bass right here and I want it to be sidechained to my kick and my snare, right? So what I would do is to set up a compressor on my sub that gets triggered every time the kick and the snare hit, right? Now this is way too tedious for me. The way I do it is to literally draw in a volume envelope, right, for the sub. So this right here is an automation clip for the sub right here. So this is the master volume of my sub channel, and check this out. It jumps up and down whenever, you know, a sample gets triggered. So I have different envelopes for the different drum samples that I use to trigger this automation clip, right? So this would be an envelope for the kick, and the one for the snare would be this one. See, it's I use different side chains because I wanted to match the shape of the sample, at least roughly. And I would do it visually first, right? I would roughly estimate it with my eyes, and then I would just use my ears to check out if it sounds correctly. So, and this would be the lazy way to do it, actually, because even if my life depended on it, I couldn't tell a difference between a sidechain that was made with a compressor versus a sidechain that was made like this. So I just stick to this, and it's actually really precise. Like, I don't need no look ahead function. I don't need to calculate anything. I don't like compressors per se. Like, I only like compressors for sound design and things like that, and sometimes, for the mastering process, but sidechaining not so much. I think sidechain compression with a compressor was done back in the day because they didn't have these tools like this. I think if they had a visual representation of their automation clips, I think everyone would have done it like this. But that's just my 2 cents. All right, let's move on to sequencing. Okay, so there's a couple of ways you can program or sequence your drums in FL Studio. Unfortunately, though, the most popular way also happens to be the worst possible way to do it. I'm talking about the step sequencer. So this little shit right here, no offense, by the way, I love ImageLine and your products. FL Studio is my favorite program ever, but man, this gotta be the reason FL Studio gets such a bad reputation. Just look at this. If you're still using this, I want you to reconsider your life choices, because this is possibly the worst way to program your drums, period. There's a couple of things wrong with this, obviously, but for one, this is ancient technology. Like, this is 40 years old, bro. Just for reference, when this came out, the Cold War was still ongoing. Can you believe that shit? I have no idea why they still keep this thing alive. They got rid of the pattern blocks. Okay, whatever. I liked them, but I guess we have to move on. But bro, let it go. I don't want to see this every time I open this, man. My guess is they do this for nostalgic reasons. Like, you're not actually supposed to use it. You're just supposed to look at it and go, oh wow, man, things used to be really horrible. I'm sure glad we have better tools today. I mean, I get it. It's super fast. You can make a beat in literally 30 seconds. But then again, who the fuck needs to make a beat in 30 seconds? If you don't have 5 minutes on your hands to make a beat, like, how busy can you be? Okay, just look at this. What you're looking at here isn't actually your drum loop. This is a low resolution representation of your drum loop. So it's symbolic at best. Okay, all the essential information of your drums is missing. The only thing I see is when the audio clip gets triggered in this bar. Everything else I kind of need to know or to guess. So how long is the sample? I don't know. What about velocity? No idea. Starting time? Some samples actually don't start right away. Just look at this snare here, for example. It has a pre-delay of a couple of milliseconds, and this isn't taken into account here. It's just maybe you get a weird delay for some reason and you don't know where it's coming from because you can't see the sample. Anyway, let's play our beat and move on. Now let's import this pattern into our playlist. And this is how it looks. What the fuck? I can't see anything. There's no information for me. And opening this in the piano roll isn't gonna help me either, because MIDI is just a bad format for drums, period. In my opinion, MIDI is only good for chords and stuff like that, but not for drums. You really gotta work with audio, man. There's no way around it. Now, what I did is to translate this MIDI pattern from the step sequencer into audio clips. We can now begin to see what some of the problems might be. So right away you can see that the kick is extremely long. It interferes with itself multiple times. Just look at this. What the fuck? How is anyone supposed to mix that down, right? No wonder you mix this Armati, bro. And the first kick isn't even done when the second one hits, and then the third one comes in, and the interference from the first and the second one, bro, it's just a huge mess. Everything is piling up, and there's no way to really see what's going on. But this is also just a rough estimate of what's actually going on. We need to record this into Edison to see the entire picture. You can see the peaks here that are caused by the interference of the kick with itself and the other elements. And a lot of people want to know how to get a louder mix. And here's the answer, at least in part. There's frequencies piling up uncontrollably that don't serve any purpose. So if you get rid of those, your mix will be louder because you have more space to work with. Now, here's another version where I did just that. I fixed the overlapping drum samples with volume automation. Pretty basic, pretty simple. Now, let's record this version in Edison. There's almost no difference in sound, but check this out. If we normalize both versions, see how the second version is more dense and controlled just by the looks of it. And you can see it in the RMS levels as well. The first version barely touches -10. The second version gets to -8 dB. So you just save 2 dBs, all without compression. So arranging your drums in the playlist will inevitably give you cleaner results because you just see what's going on. So after a while, you will just have a better feel for audio, for drums, for overlapping, for interference and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. For the most part, genres in music are determined by tempo and drum pattern. At least that's the case for most electronic music. So you can roughly determine the genre just by looking at those two pillars alone. So every genre has its own pulse, so to speak, right? So when I'm programming my drums, I always try to find that groove, find that pulse. And the way I do it is to try to match a drum pattern with the right BPM. And I know this sounds super basic, but there's a lot more nuance to this than one might expect at first, because this alone, this matching of BPM and pattern, can take forever, and I sometimes change my mind about BPM until very far into the process sometimes, because this will depend on many parameters of the song. So every time I introduce a new element, for example, this might change the entire dynamic of my pattern. So like I said before, all the elements in your song are connected with one another. So I might ask a series of questions every couple of sessions, which is like, how busy is the rest of the track? How much swing is in the drums? So how much space do I need in between the hits? How much is going on? How many off-grid elements are there, etc., etc. So it's a long process of going back and forth, adding things, removing things, speeding the whole thing up to see when it becomes too tight, too busy, too dense, slowing it down again to figure out when it falls apart, then replacing samples, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of tedious to do it this way, but that way I make sure to find the sweet spot between all the parameters. And I always get rewarded with the drum pattern that sounds like a coherent loop and not just like a bunch of samples thrown on a pile. So if you're having trouble with this and your drum pattern kind of sounds robotic, or it sounds, incoherent, then you might want to consider paying more attention to the relationship between pattern and tempo. And this goes back to the concept of context, but now applied on time. So another quick note on the context thing. The more character a sample has, right, a single drum sample, the more space it needs for itself in between hits, because otherwise it will get way too annoying. So for example, let's take dubstep versus drum and bass, right? Dubstep is kind of a slow genre, right? It's halftime, and there's a lot of emphasis on the snare because there's only one snare per every bar, right? It hits on 3, and then the next snare hits on the next 3 from the next bar. You want to make sure to pick a snare that counts, right? You want to take a snare with a lot of character, because if you pick a snare with no character at all, it won't have enough strength to carry the track, because there's just too much space in between each snare hit, and there's nothing to look forward to until the next snare hit comes, right? And on the other hand, in drum and bass, which is a very fast genre, you might be better off picking a more functional snare that blends in better, because if you pick a snare that's too special, it will just stand out like a sore thumb, and it's really hard to mix, and it will annoy your audience after a while. So keep that in mind. I believe this is something one can't be taught. You really only can learn this from your own experience, but I will guarantee you, the more you do this, the more you listen to tracks, and the more tracks you make yourself, the better you get at sample choice and things like that. So just keep at it, and keep making songs. All right, that would be it for drums. See you next time when we finally get to the vocal chops.